According to records, there are 20,000 unexplainable disappearances attributed to the Alaska Triangle since the 1970s. The Bermuda Triangle has only seen a little over 2,300 disappearances since 1945. Think the Bermuda Triangle is terrifying? Well, welcome to the Alaska Triangle, whose haunting mysteries make Bermuda look like a walk in the park. It's the morning of October 16, 1972, 9 a.m. sharp. House Majority Leader Hale Boggs and Alaska Representative Nick Begich depart Anchorage in a Cessna C-310. Their destination? Juneau, Alaska, where a campaign rally is about to hold. Elections are around the corner, and Boggs is holding up his end of the bargain to do what he can to make sure Begich gets re-elected into the House of Representatives. The Cessna C-310 is a small plane, so only 2 other men are traveling with the congressman. One of them is Russell Brown, Begich's special assistant. The other is Don Johns, the pilot. Even though Anchorage and Juneau are both in Alaska, flying from one point to the other still takes about 3.5 hours. On this particular day, the visibility isn't so good. There's mild turbulence and the weather conditions are icy. But hey, that's just Alaska, and this isn't a trip the men aren't used to. Plus, Johns is an experienced pilot. Nothing unusual was supposed to happen. Until it did. 10 minutes after takeoff, Johns communicates with the control tower. Up to this point, the journey has been uneventful, and the 4 men expect that it will continue like this until they land. Unknown to them, they have just made their final contact with the world. They will never be seen or heard from again. When the congressmen don't arrive a full hour after their ETA, the U.S. Coast Guard, the Navy Army, the Air Force, the Civil Air Patrol, and other civilian volunteers begin a nearly 40-day search for them in what has become one of America's most intensive rescue missions ever. Mysteriously, to this very day, not a single trace of the Cessna C-310 or its passengers has been found. Not a piece of debris, not a fiber of clothing, not a bit of human remains. Nothing. The plane and its entire crew could have slipped into another dimension for all anyone knows. What's more horrifying? The vanishing of Boggs and Begich isn't a rare occurrence. Not in the Alaska Triangle. According to records, there are 19,999 other unexplainable vanishings attributed to the Alaska Triangle. Some just as bizarre, others even more bizarre. Think the Bermuda Triangle is terrifying? Well, welcome to the Alaska Triangle, whose haunting mysteries make Bermuda look like a walk in the park. When we talk of the Alaska Triangle, we aren't referring to strict geographical boundaries. Generally, we're talking of a vast wilderness area that extends from Utqiagvik to Anchorage and then to Juneau. And because the Alaska Triangle is mostly harsh wilderness, it's barely inhabited. In fact, as of today, not up to 1 million people live in the whole of Alaska, even though it's the biggest state in the US. And yet, every year, the state continues to hold the record for the highest missing persons average in the country, with an average of 2,250 people going missing every single year. That's about 4 in every 1,000 people, which is highly unusual and disturbing, especially for how uninhabited Alaska is. Interest in the Alaska Triangle officially began in 1972 with the disappearance of Hale Boggs and Nick Begich. However, 22 years earlier, a much stranger plane disappearance had already been reported in the Alaska Triangle. The day was January 26, 1950, and a plane carrying 36 passengers and 8 crewmen was on its way to Great Falls, Canada from Anchorage. Just as the plane crossed the Alaska border into the Yukon Territory, the pilot communicated with the control tower. In about 20 minutes, the plane would land in Great Falls, marking the end of that journey. Tragically, that message to the control tower would become the last thing anyone ever heard from anyone on that flight. And once again, just like in the Boggs and Begich case, not a single piece of debris would be found. The plane and everyone in it simply vanished without a trace. But the Alaska Triangle vanishings have not yet gotten as bizarre as they can possibly get. It gets even more odd. In 2012, a marathon runner, Paul Lemaitre, was just finishing up his final lap of the race when he vanished into thin air. The last anyone ever saw of Lemaitre was when he gave his bib number to a race official at just about 200 feet from the finish line. From then on, however, there's no trail, not a single clue where he could have gone. State troopers, mountain rescue experts, and even search dogs would be deployed to sweep the area for the 65-year-old. But despite all the efforts and the really tiny search area needed to cover, not a trace of the man has been found till today. It's been 12 whole years since then. But if you wonder if things can get more bizarre, well, they definitely can. In 1995, Erin Marie Gilbert, a 6-foot-tall, 24-year-old woman, was attending the Gridfoot Forest Fair in Alaska with her date David Combs when she went missing. Once again, the story is as peculiar as they come. After a wonderful time at the fair, Erin and David decided they wanted to go home. So they walked to his car, only to find out that the car battery had run out. Naturally, David went out to look for help, while Erin remained in the car waiting for him, where it was supposed to be safe. By the time David returned to the car, however, Erin had vanished. Where exactly did Erin vanish to? To this day, the case remains unsolved. Neither Erin nor her remains have been found. In fact, to date, there is nothing for police to work with. No crime scene, no human remains, no witnesses, nothing. It's been 30 years, and police are still no closer to unraveling the mystery of Erin's disappearance any more than they were when she first went missing. Of course, there's also the case of George Ryan Johnson and Marc-Andre Leclerc. In 2018, the duo attempted summiting the Mendenhall Towers about 12 miles from Juneau. Per their plan, George and Marc-Andre would begin their expedition on March 5th, make the climb, and then return on March 7th. However, when March 7th came, neither of the two was anywhere to be found. When search efforts began, all the volunteers could find were the men's ski equipment and an intact anchor rope which they had left behind at the base of the mountain. Their climbing ropes were also intact and seemed to show that the men indeed summited the mountain. Unfortunately, no trace of the men themselves or anything they had on them during their climb has been found till today. And to be clear, these men weren't novices. Both were two of the very best climbers in North America, with multiple awards to their credit. Yet they vanished without a trace, just like the eerie case of the Siberian climbers on Mount Kailash. How could that have happened? The mere frequency and unsolvability of disappearance cases in Alaska stretches every conceivable boundary of reality. Even the odds of lightning striking in the same place twice are not very high. How much more the odds of hundreds of people coincidentally vanishing in the same place in the same manner every single year? There's definitely something mysterious going on at the Alaska Triangle, and many have a couple of theories about what could be causing the bizarre vanishings. The first Alaska Triangle theory posits that the vanishings might be the work of aliens. And expectedly, this would probably make many skeptics roll their eyes harder than Mitchell Pritchett in any given episode of Modern Family. But as it turns out, the Alaska Triangle happens to provide one of the most credible, documented pieces of evidence of an extraterrestrial sighting ever. Before we get to that, however, we need to talk about this top-secret military project called Stargate. In 1977, the US government had reason to believe that the Soviets were investing heavily in psychotronic research. So naturally, the US wanted to know more about what the Soviets were up to, which was how Project Stargate was born. Project Stargate was a CIA mission to see how psychical abilities could be harnessed in military and domestic intelligence situations. Which sounds funny until we somehow discover it's totally possible, and then it no longer is. It's not possible, by the way. Project Stargate was a flop, but it did have one happy side effect. The CIA discovered an alien base. The core of Project Stargate centered around remote viewing. Remote viewing is when people with alleged psychic abilities collect intelligence on people or places not by going undercover like your typical spy agent, but by traveling to meet said target in their mind. You can say it's cuckoo, but the CIA didn't think so, and invested in this cuckoo idea. Here's how it works, and this is very relevant to everything we're going to be talking about next, so I'm going to need you to pay attention. In a typical remote viewing session, the remote viewer and an interviewer are isolated with a target. The target may be a picture, coordinates, or randomly generated numbers. Whatever it is, the target will be placed in a sealed envelope to ensure that the session is double-blind. That is, neither viewer nor interviewer is allowed to know who or what the target is. And it's important that the interviewer is also blind to the target because, otherwise, they could unwittingly feed information to the viewer while asking their questions, which could compromise the authenticity of the viewing session. As the session proceeds, the interviewer will ask the remote viewer questions or give them certain prompts like, describe the location inside the envelope. Then, as the viewer begins to see the target, they could either sketch or write down what they are doing. Alright, now that you know how remote viewing works, we'll move ahead with the story. I'll just jump forward to where the action is. In 1973, Pat Price, a top remote viewer, turned in a report to the head of the remote viewing program in the Stargate project, Hal Puthoff. All he said was, "You might be interested in these UFO bases." And with that, the game was officially afoot. Apparently, during one of Price's remote viewing sessions for Project Stargate, he had discovered 4 underground extraterrestrial bases spread across the globe. One was beneath Mount Perdido, somewhere between France and Spain. Another was beneath Mount Nyangani in Zimbabwe. Another one was underneath Mount Zeal in Australia. And the final one was beneath Mount Hayes in Alaska. Now, when it comes to remote viewing, Price isn't someone you just ignore. Former CIA Director Stansfield Turner referred to him as a man who could see what was going on anywhere in the world through his psychic powers. And this wasn't mere flattery. Price could back it up. For instance, during the Cold War, Price sketched cranes and gantries behind Soviet lines using only maps and photographs provided by the CIA. And when CIA intelligence photos showed up later, Price was right on the money. So, when Hal Puthoff read the report from Price claiming there were 4 underground extraterrestrial bases on planet Earth, Puthoff knew better than to call it mere crazy talk. Besides, Price's report was hardly vague. It contained graphic descriptions of each of the bases he had found with intricate details of structures inside these bases. But since our video today is about the Alaska Triangle, we're only going to focus on the underground base at Mount Hayes. But if you want us to do a video about the underground base at Mount Hayes, let us know in the comments section. And if we get like 300 comments asking for the video, we will do a video on it. Price described the base under Mount Hayes as a weather and geological center reinforced with highly sophisticated security measures that made the discovery of the site impossible through ordinary means. In fact, according to Price, if anyone made it their mission to try and discover this site, the aliens at the base would deploy personnel to physically infiltrate such a mission and ensure that it fails, suggesting that these aliens are shapeshifters of some sort. That's not all. Price also claimed in his report that it was this underground extraterrestrial base that caused all the strange activity and malfunction of US and Soviet space projects. Could Price be referring to all the UFOs encountered by US astronauts during Apollo missions? Well, he doesn't say specifically, But anyway, for about 9 years after Price reported his findings, nothing was done about his discoveries until 1982, when the report got to Skip Atwater's desk. Skip was the officer in charge of Project Stargate. Boasting many psychic experiences himself and having great respect for Price, he took the report very seriously and decided to follow up on it by getting other viewers to confirm Price's findings. And it's from this point on that things get a little more interesting. Here is Joe McMoneagle. When it comes to remote viewing, very few stand with him in his class. So when Atwater needed to confirm this highly delicate discovery, it was a no-brainer. Joe McMoneagle was the man to call. Per standard remote viewing protocol, Atwater only gave McMoneagle the coordinates for Mount Hayes and did not give him anything else, not even a mention of Price's work or the fact that he was looking for an alien base.
It's defensive, not offensive, like a shield of some kind. Very high charged, very excited, coherent pulses of positive charged particles. It's never been used on a full output. Still experimental. The power is weird. It's like I don't think it's ever been done.
McMoneagle also goes on to mention that what he perceives is underground and powered by an atomic power plant, although he does not have the language to describe what he is seeing, suggesting that whatever this place is, it isn't a place that he, or maybe even humans in general, are familiar with. This was huge, but it wasn't enough. Atwater needed to be double sure. So he gave the same target to a different remote viewer, Mel Riley. Once again, he kept the session blind to ensure transparency. And once again, what Riley saw confirmed Price's earlier findings. Riley confirmed seeing a mountainous region with an impregnable base underneath. However, unlike McMoneagle, who said he didn't see any entity at the base, Riley confirmed seeing a few humanoid beings at the base. He described the beings as having a human form, but lacking definitive facial features. But he also said they were friendly and that they invited him to come and observe what they were doing. It's not clear what Skip Atwater and Hal Puthoff did after Project 8200, the mission to confirm Price's underground ET-based discoveries, but talks about the underground base at Mount Hayes kind of fizzled, until about 4 years later when a very strange flight incident revived it. On November 17, 1986, Japan Airlines Flight 1628 was on its way to Tokyo from Paris. On the plane was a skeletal crew and a cargo of Beaujolais wine. And since the journey was a rather long one, about 14 hours, the crew made a plan to stop over at Reykjavik in Iceland and Anchorage in Alaska to refuel. As you might have already predicted, the Reykjavik stopover happened without incident. The stopover at Anchorage, however, was a totally different story. After the Anchorage stopover, Captain Kinju Terauchi, who manned the flight, resumed the journey, hoping for an uneventful flight. Unfortunately for him, that was not going to happen. Just a few minutes after takeoff, he was going to play host to some uninvited guests. As Terauchi described it, some bright lights started shining into his window. At first, the captain assumed that the lights were coming from military planes, so he ignored them and kept flying, until he realized that the lights were now following him. A little worried, Terauchi reached out to the control tower, asking if there was any military or civilian flight in the same space with him at the time. Control tower responded in the negative. Meanwhile, Terauchi's radar showed this large, green, and round object, while the light coming from the mysterious craft continued to shine brighter than ever, to the point where Terauchi could feel the warmth of the light on his face. Perhaps these were thrusters? Anyway, Terauchi soon made it above the Eielson Air Force Base near Fairbanks, where he sighted yet another UFO. This time, however, the craft in question was a ginormous spaceship. And Terauchi got the feeling that this new ginormous spaceship was probably the mothership to the other UFO he saw earlier. Overwhelmed with panic, the captain tried everything he could to lose the ship. Alarmingly, with every move Terauchi made to lose the ship simply mirrored, worsening the pilot's unease. Luckily for him, however, relief was on the way. As Terauchi's game of monkey see, monkey do with the mothership continued, a United Airlines passenger jet flew into airspace. The control tower, which still couldn't see what Terauchi was talking about, reached out to the United Airlines flight asking for a confirmation of visuals of the UFO. But then, just at that precise moment, the UFO disappeared. Or at least, that's what everyone thought, until data from the military radar at the Elmendorf Air Force Base revealed that the UFO didn't disappear, it simply slipped behind the United Airlines flight and started to trail it. Thankfully, this story does not end in the sort of disaster that has come to characterize the Alaska Triangle. What happens next, however, is no less confusing. So now it's been a week since Flight 1628 landed, and no one can deny what happened. A military radar picked up on UFOs in American airspace, multiple aerial objects that simply had no earthly explanation. What happens next? Well, the government begins investigations into these UFOs, but then, curiously, orders absolute silence from all participants involved in the investigation. It begs the question, why? Why is the government insisting on silence? Do they know something? Whatever the case, it doesn't matter, because unfortunately for their plan, John Callahan, Chief of Accidents and Investigations at the FFA at the time, had copies of all the evidence regarding the case in his office, and he was not about to keep the American public in the dark about alien creatures flying with impunity in their airspace. But back to the point, the UFO sighting incident of Flight 1628 isn't just one of the most credible UFO sightings over the Alaska Triangle, it's one of the most credible UFO sightings, period. We've got military-grade radars picking up on this stuff. This isn't Bush League. Whatever you think about psychic abilities, mediums, and seances, you've got to admit that the odds of Price reporting underground alien bases, 2 other remote viewers confirming the same thing 9 whole years later, and then Flight 1628 having the experience it had, the odds that all of these were simply coincidences sounds more like a conspiracy theory than to say then there really could be aliens in the Alaska Triangle abducting people. After all, it's not going to be the first time people got abducted by aliens. Perhaps that's what's happening at the Alaska Triangle? People were getting abducted? Well, probably. The only aspect of the story that still wouldn't make sense would be the permanent disappearances. In most alien abduction accounts, abductees always return. They may return feeling disoriented and suffering through nightmares every night afterward, but for most alien abduction accounts, the abductee always returns. So is there something more sinister at play here? Very possibly. Now, there was something I didn't mention in Riley's report. When relaying what he saw at the underground ET base at Mount Hayes, Riley mentioned that he saw alien creatures that looked exactly like humans except for their hearts and lungs. This is relatively new in popular alien lore, but it fits perfectly with the shape-shifting humanoids that Price reported seeing during his own viewing. If you're familiar with the space, then you know that most who claim to have encountered aliens always report the aliens as looking distinct from humans, not the kind of aliens that Riley or Price saw. The aliens at the base of Mount Hayes, however, looked very different, like a product of a hybrid between aliens and humans. Could the disappearances at the Alaska Triangle have anything to do with them? Well, if you ask Marshall Vian Summers, a popular paranormal author, the answer is yes. Summers is the founder of a religious movement that has exotheology at its core. Exotheology has to do with spiritual beliefs and how they account for extraterrestrial dimensions and beings, by the way. Anyway, according to Summers, who claims that he receives communication from extraterrestrial beings, there is a colony of aliens on our planet right now seeking to control the world. Normally, we wouldn't bother to give this claim a second look, but we've seen verifiable evidence of extraterrestrial presence at the Alaska Triangle, so the least we can do is hear the rest of what Summers has to say, and here it is. Summers claims that these aliens cohabiting with us right now consider humans a mere natural resource, just like humans view animals as one of Earth's resources. He then goes further to claim that, according to the information communicated to him by his extraterrestrial contact, when humans are abducted by aliens, some are experimented on and held hostage. Those who don't survive the ordeal end up being used for their blood, plasma, DNA, bone marrow, skin, and body organs, which the aliens use to create medicines or, get this, breed new life forms. This seems to fit perfectly with what Mel Riley and Pat Price saw during their remote viewing of the alien base under Mount Hayes. Now, let's take a breather. These are just one man's claims, and it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that we have no reason to even accept the claims for consideration. However, Summers' alleged messages from the benevolent extraterrestrials seem to be the only explanation on offer for the peculiar extraterrestrial beings Riley saw during his remote viewing. And even if on paper only, the truth is, it makes a lot of sense, especially in light of what Mel Riley and Pat Price saw. Not to mention the old Native Alaskan lore that talks about shape-shifting creatures who abduct people and either turn them into creatures like them or eat them up. As a matter of fact, in 1900, a certain man had a run-in with these creatures while on an expedition in Alaska. He only very narrowly escaped them, and his tale sheds more light on the mysterious inhabitants of the Alaska Triangle. But more on that soon. For now, it's enough to ask ourselves, could the Alaska Triangle truly be the home of a race of shape-shifting human/alien hybrids abducting people and using them to make new breeds of alien beings? While you explore that thought, here's another angle on the extraterrestrial theory to explore: the Dark Pyramid Theory. The first time we ever hear of an Alaskan pyramid, it's from award-winning reporter and alternative researcher Linda Moulton Howe. Basically, Linda says that she was told by a certain retired naval officer that there's a dark, underground pyramid in Alaska that's thousands of years old and about 4 times the size of the Pyramid of Giza. Apparently, this ex-naval officer and about 8,000 others had worked on a top-secret project to install military-grade radars out there in the Alaskan wilderness. One was called the White Alice, and the other was called the Distant Early Warning Line System, also known as the DEW Line. Anyway, these radars were supposed to help the military detect incoming Soviet bombers or any land or sea invasion. But according to the ex-Navy man, in the process of installation, the scientists began to pick up on an unusually high level of EMI, which is short for electromagnetic interference. Now, initially, the theory was that a team of Soviet military engineers had probably built an underground EMI generator to throw off the White Alice and DEW Line comms system. However, when the installation team eventually got to the site and dug underground, what they found was a huge stone pyramid about 4 times the cubic volume of the Cheops in Egypt. Granted, this theory seems so far out there, but it does have the marks of a factual theory. For one, the White Alice and the DEW Line are actual communication systems that were set up in Alaska during the Cold War, which coincides with the timeline Linda says the ex-Navy man told her. Also, as it turns out, we have both seismological evidence and 4 eyewitness accounts corroborating this claim. But since the Alaskan pyramid isn't the focus of our video today, we will only look into the scientific evidence and 1 eyewitness account of this pyramid. Again, if you want us to do a video on it, leave a comment below. So, in May 1992, China carried out an underground nuclear test. As expected, the shockwaves from the test were very powerful. In fact, they were so powerful that American seismologists on the other side of the globe were able to use the waves to map out some parts of the Earth's crust. And it was while they were doing this that they stumbled on a structure that stopped them in their tracks. There in the images, very clearly defined, was a pyramidal structure precisely matching the dark pyramid account Linda Moulton Howe had been talking about for years before then. The next day, news about the newly discovered underground pyramid made the airwaves. The news particularly caught the attention of one Doug Muchler, a military officer at the Fort Richardson military base. Muchler found the news fascinating, but soon discovered that he was the only one who knew what he was talking about. No one else, including those who saw the news that same evening, seemed to know what he was talking about. Not even when he went to the news station to request information on the story. In fact, the general manager of the news outlet specifically said that their station hadn't run any news of such, and that the story didn't even exist in the first place. But just as Muchler was becoming convinced that he was losing his mind, he got vindicated. One of the film editors at the channel reached out to him and confirmed to him that the story he was talking about was real and that it had, in fact, aired on the station the night before. The information gave Muchler the boldness he needed to dig through government files, hoping to find the answer to the mystery of the Dark Pyramid. Bizarrely, just as he commenced his search, he got an unplanned visit from 2 unidentified men. The men, who appeared to be government officials, seized Muchler's files and warned him to stop digging as he didn't have clearance. Threatened, Muchler heeded the advice of the unidentified men. But he never forgot his weird experience and the mysterious news story about the mysterious underground pyramid. 20 years later, Muchler would reach out to Linda Moulton Howe with his story, which brings us back to now. Alright, so what does an underground pyramid have to do with mysterious disappearances? Well, here's where it gets spooky. On May 27, 2020, 41-year-old Nathan Campbell decided to follow the trail of these stories and find this pyramid for himself. A pyramid so powerful that it could generate more than enough electricity to power not just the whole of Alaska, but a large part of Canada as well. Campbell had mapped out his journey. He was going to explore the wilderness for about 4 months, and then sometime in mid-September, a friend was going to come and pick him up. That was the arrangement. Well, it's been 4 years since September 15th, 2020, and still, Campbell hasn't returned. So, could Campbell's disappearance have something to do with the underground pyramid and its powerful electromagnetic force field? Well, this is where the conversation segues into something called vile vortices. Those who are familiar with pyramidology would often tell you that the locations of all the megalithic structures that wow us today are not random. Ancient civilizations, they say, built those structures, be they pyramids or Stonehenge, at those precise spots after perceiving the strong waves of energy coming off from them. This also is why we tend to get reports of strange phenomena happening almost exclusively around megalithic structures, whether it's malfunctioning compasses, vanishing tourists, unexplained aging, aircraft disappearances, or time travel. Now, in the 60s, a paranormal investigator known as Ivan T. Sanderson tried to plot these strange phenomena on an atlas. And in doing this, he discovered that there were 12 specific locations around the world where mysterious disappearances, whether of persons or planes or ships, tended to happen. Not only were these locations, which Sanderson called vile vortices, home to mysterious happenings, they were also equidistant from one another. And together, they formed the vertices of an icosahedron, or a 20-faced polyhedron. Sanderson's theory, therefore, was that it was the vile vortices caused by electromagnetic anomalies that were responsible for the various unexplained disasters typically recorded at certain specific locations around the world. The question would now be, is Alaska one of the 12 homes of vile vortices? Well, it does have all the markings. Besides the testimony of the ex-Navy man who helped install the White Alice and the Dew Line, we've also heard testimonies from rescue volunteers who report experiencing weird hallucinations, a symptom that has been linked to an exposure to electromagnetic force by the Canadian cognitive neuroscientist Michael Persinger. Secondly, there's seismological proof of a massive underground pyramid in Alaska. 3. Loads and loads of unexplained vanishings have been reported there as well. So it would appear that Alaska is home to one of the vilest vortices there is. Or at least that's what most would think. Oddly enough, however, the Alaska Triangle is not mentioned on Sanderson's list of vile vortices. The Bermuda Triangle, whose mysteries have now been debunked, is mentioned, but the Alaska Triangle isn't. Now, there are two ways we could explain this. On one hand, Sanderson's vile vortex research was carried out in the 60s, about a full decade before word of the Alaska Triangle started to spread, so it's possible he left out the site during his research because he didn't know about it at the time. On the other hand, perhaps the whole vile vortex theory is just a bunch of hooey. We'll find out about that soon enough. But for now, let's explore our next theory, the Kushtaka. As I mentioned earlier, the Tlingit people of Alaska speak of a shape-shifting race of beings called the Kushtaka, or land otter people. According to the lores, the Kushtaka abduct people who get lost in the woods or drowned in the river and then eat them or turn them into Kushtaka themselves. The Tlingit people say that these land otter people would lure their victims by imitating the cries of an infant or by screaming like a damsel in distress. And yes, this all sounds like superstitious stories parents tell their kids to keep them from wandering off into the woods. Perhaps Harry Colp also thought the same thing in 1900 when he set out for Thomas Bay in search of gold. All it took, however, was one near-death experience, and that was enough to change his mind. Here's Colp's story. One evening, Colp had gone out to hunt. The hunt was quite successful. However, on his way back to base, he got the scare of his life, to use his words. Writing about the event in his journal, Colp explains that he suddenly looked behind him and saw a horde of the most hideous, putrid-smelling beasts who started to pursue him for reasons he did not understand. I couldn't call them anything but devils, as they were neither men nor monkeys, yet they looked like both, writes Colp. They were entirely sexless, their bodies covered with long, coarse hair, except where the scabs and running sores had replaced it. Each one seemed to be reaching out for me and striving to be the first to get me. The air was full of their cries, and the stench from their sores and bodies made me faint. In the end, the beasts did not get to Colp. He somehow made it to his canoe and on to safety before they could. But not before one of them managed to leave a scratch on his back with its claw-like fingers. For a long time, the diary in which Colp recorded his encounter would be lost to history, until it was later discovered by his daughter after his death. This journal has now been reproduced as a book called The Strangest Story Ever Told. So if you're curious, you should check it out and read Colp's account for yourself. A mythical Sasquatch-like creature or an evil race of shape-shifting beasts may not be the sort of stuff you'd buy when it comes to mysterious phenomena like the ones reported in the Alaska Triangle. And as always, we will explore other less otherworldly perspectives to this mystery that might provide a simpler, although less sensational explanation. But here's something I noticed about the theories we've explored so far. Individually, they may not suffice to explain what's happening at the Alaska Triangle, but together they fit almost too conveniently, like a jigsaw puzzle, forming one mega-theory that could provide the answers we seek. Here's what I'm saying. What if the malevolent beasts spoken of in native Alaskan mythology were actually one and the same as the alien human creatures Price and Riley saw? Recall that the Kushtaka is described as being very human-looking. The Kushtaka is also said to have shape-shifting abilities, and in other testimonies of people who have encountered the creature, there are reports that the beast, though animalistic, does have the ability to converse in human language. This fits perfectly with the findings of the Stargate and Project 8200 remote viewing sessions. Now, recall that the aliens built a highly impregnable fort underneath Mount Hayes, according to the remote viewers. If that's true, then by extension, these extraterrestrial beings also probably built the underground pyramid as well, perhaps drawn by the powerful electromagnetic field there. It's also entirely possible that there are multiple other underground alien bases all over Alaska, all contributing to the strange disappearances. But as I said earlier, it all fits a little too conveniently. Plus, each of these theories is highly speculative and has major flaws. Now, to be clear, not all Alaska Triangle theories are born equal. Some are very easy to debunk, like the Harry Colp story. There's simply no way to prove that it's not fiction. Author Irving Werner, who interviewed Virginia, Colp's daughter, stated that Virginia couldn't and wouldn't say if her father's story was true, false, or simply a hallucination. So the Colp story is merely shaky evidence for the existence of the Kushtaka. Which takes us to the vile vortices. Many people, especially New Agers, believe in vortices, both vile and positive ones. Some even claim to have supernatural experiences at positive vortices, including healing and seeing visions. However, there's little scientific evidence to support their existence. The underground pyramid theory does not hold up well either. First off, nearly all we have to go on with this theory is from the testimony of one woman, Linda Moulton Howe. And some skeptics have said that the pyramid was very likely built by Linda in her mind as a way to make a quick buck. The one event that could have proven Linda's proposition once and for all was the Chinese underground nuclear test in 1992, but it turns out that the actual story is quite different from the one being told by proponents of the Dark Pyramid theory. Yes, China did carry out an underground nuclear test in 1992, but no, American seismologists did not take any images of underground Alaska as a result of the shockwaves from the blast. And they couldn't have, because the test took everyone by surprise. So how about the news story Doug Muchler saw the following day announcing the discovery of the underground pyramid in Alaska? Well, first off, no one else saw this story, including his own father, who also watched the news the evening it aired. Even if the news station was conspiring to make the pyramid story go away, was his father also part of the conspiracy? Besides, there's just no transcript evidence, even from independent transcription agencies, of this particular story. What we do find instead is a coverage of Egyptian pyramids and news reports of an earthquake that hit Cairo around the fall of 1986 when Muchler saw his news story. Now, considering Muchler only shared his story with Linda 20 years after watching said news report, the odds seem very high that his memory was simply playing tricks on him. This leaves us with the extraterrestrial theory. Frankly, this is the hardest theory to debunk. Of course, this does not automatically make it true, as we'd have to find a way to drill beneath Mount Hayes and confirm there's actually an alien base there. Besides, the theory is one of those overly convenient ones in which the absence of proof is presented as proof of existence. Price claimed in his report that the alien base was undetectable by regular physical apparatus. This makes the alien base impossible to disprove, because if an expedition is actually done and nothing is observed beneath the mountain, that becomes proof that Price was right. In other words, we'd just have to take the viewer's word for it, which cannot be how we make conclusions. But then again, that's not the only evidence for extraterrestrial activity in the Alaska Triangle. We still have the UFOs and mothership sighted by the crew of JAL Flight 1628 in 1986, and there's simply no other way to explain away what was seen that night. The control tower confirmed that there was no other flight at the time, whether military or civilian. Yet, the military controller tracked the movement of a UFO whose home and destination no one knew. Plus, if nothing worth mentioning happened during that flight, then why did the government swear all involved parties to secrecy? This leaves the door to the ET theory still open at the very least. By the way, if you want to go crazy and explore that rabbit hole, there are a bunch of links in the description from declassified CIA records to other declassified government files. Feel free to knock yourself out. All that said, here's something else to consider. Maybe, just maybe, the simple explanation for all of this is that Alaska is huge. You see, the Alaskan wilderness alone spans 57 million acres of land, which means that it will swallow the Grand Canyon more than 40 times and still have space for more. On top of that, Alaska is full of massive glaciers and giant crevices, and to make things worse, the weather is notoriously unpredictable over there. There are frequent thunderstorms and lightning strikes with extreme temperature fluctuations and year-round snowstorms. So it's not difficult to imagine a plane crashing into a mountain, triggering an avalanche, and getting buried immediately underneath a massive blanket of snow in minutes. Nor is it impossible for a person to miss their way, fall into a giant crevice, and become lost forever. Besides, the Alaskan wilderness is so dangerous that there's not much you have to do before you put yourself at the risk of instant death. One tiny mistake, as tiny as sleeping in a wet bag, is all it takes for a person to freeze to their death. Now, if any of these things I've just talked about should happen, the chances of ever finding such victims would be very low, especially since Alaska is largely uninhabited and there aren't any CCTV cameras out there. This means there's no way to track a person's final moments, which introduces another layer of complexity to rescue efforts. Speaking of, rescue efforts are not always that straightforward when it comes to Alaska. First off, the unpredictably bad weather means that search efforts sometimes have to be postponed until after a couple of days. For a place that's quickly covered in massive heaps of snow in a matter of hours, this worsens a missing person's luck significantly. Secondly, Alaska's search area to manpower ratio is far higher than other states of the US, which typically have a smaller terrain to cover and more than enough hands to conduct searches. So, as you can see, there are lots of factors that work together against people who go missing in the Alaska Triangle without having to reach for otherworldly explanations. And I've not even talked about the over 300,000 grizzlies that call Alaska home. It does seem very telling that alongside the unusually high missing persons rate, accidental injuries also occur at twice the national rate in Alaska, ranking as the third leading cause of death. So yes, it does seem very likely that this is what's happening. Ultimately, Alaska is beautiful and safe if you know what to expect, but brutal and unforgiving if you don't. After all, many planes and boats do reach their destinations safely, hikers go on adventures and return safe, and though it doesn't seem like it, many who get lost in the Alaska Triangle do eventually get found. That's the other side of the story often overlooked in tales about the Alaska Triangle. Now, whether or not this is a sufficient explanation for the 20,000 missing persons in the Alaska Triangle, an abnormally high number for one state, I'd leave that up to you to decide. But speaking of strange disappearances, in the mid-20th century, a group of climbers vanished into thin air while attempting to summit a highly peculiar mountain in Asia. Several decades later, another group of climbers, young men at the time, would attempt the same climb only to die barely a year later from old age. Click on this video to find out the chilling mysteries of the sacred Mount Kailash.